four measurements we're going to do are going to be inversion and eversion of two different joints of the ankle. So we're going to be looking at the talocrural joint and the forefoot in this first set of exercises. Wow. Do you know how when you type, you will type a letter combination that you always type, even though it's nowhere close to the word you're trying to type? I apparently am having that with words today. The words I normally put together are coming out like checkbook instead of grade book. So we're going to look at inversion and eversion of, again, the talocrural joint and the forefoot, and then we're going to have Connor go into prone, and we'll look at subtalar inversion and eversion as well. Okay, so we're doing two different measurements that are really measuring two different regions of the ankle and foot. So for the first one, what you're going to do is align the stationary arm right along the anterior border of the tibia, okay? And then the moving arm is going to be right along the second ray. The axis is going to be in the mortise. So again, you're going to find the malleoli. Do you remember what part of the talus is in that area? Perhaps the trochlea, since that was the word I was saying. Okay, so we're going to line up here. So this one is the forefoot and talocrural. Sorry, I was saying subtalar before. The talocrural and forefoot inversion and eversion.
So do you do it all at the same time?
We're going to do inversion one time and eversion the other, but for all of those joints, we're doing together. We're going to do subtalar as its own, and we do that in prone. Okay? So stationary arm along the anterior edge of the tibia. Moving arm is along the second ray. The axis is over the mortise. Okay? So now, if I were going to do this passively, now you have to use this goniometer. You can't use your big goni because it needs, do you see how we're bending it? And the rigid plastic won't bend. So it needs to be this one. So if I were going to do this passively, I would have already tested for what?
End feel.
End feel, okay? Before I put the goni on. Now, if I'm going in this direction, what motion is this? It's inversion. Okay, and I'm losing his second ray a little bit. But so I'm going to hold the goni with both hands while I go into that motion. All right? So he's at 36 degrees for inversion. And now I can come into eversion, which he is not going to have normal motion. And he is at 18. Okay? So that was passive range of motion. Okay? So again, we're going to allow the goni to move with us. The goni is going to be bending. You want to stabilize it. Some of you are forgetting the stationary arm a little bit. And if you just have it like that, do you see how my thumb is holding it? And then I move the foot. Do you see how the stationary arm is moving? So did you see my grasp was like this because then it's not going to move. If you're going to hold it like this, you just need to make sure that you recheck it and make sure it's aligned. Okay? So, yes?
To be clear, that's talocrural and mid-tarsal?
Yes. Yep. Now we're going to do subtalar. So, Connor, do you mind lying on your stomach with your feet hanging off the edge? And do you mind if I write on you? Okay. So, again, use the dry erase markers. So, here, what you need to do is make 2 marks. So you're going to grab the calcaneus and you're going to bisect the calcaneus. Now some of you, when you were marking the spine, were doing dots or a whole bunch of dashes. You want it to be a single line because that's going to be easier to measure. So I've grabbed his calcaneus. I'm going to bisect it. And then what you want to do is you want to have a line that is just below the belly of the gastroc, but you don't want to bisect the muscle bellies because they're asymmetrical. What you really want to do is have a line that's going to be right on the tibia. So for some of you, what you might want to do is actually grab anteriorly and posteriorly and follow that anterior edge up and draw a line that way. The other mistake that I see is people will draw it too high. And the reason that you want it low is because you want to be able to get your goni on it. So if you have the line up here, it's going to be harder to line it up. Okay? So here we're going to put the stationary arm is going to be on the tibia. The moving arm is going to be on the calcaneus, and the axis is going to be just superior to the calcaneus. Okay? And so we are going to line him up. Now we want him to be in neutral, which for him, we want him to be in anatomical position. So I don't really want him plantar flexed. I want him to be pretty neutral there, but you go ahead and relax and let me do that part. Okay? So I've got him lined up and he's mostly at 0. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my hand placement to here, and now again I would have already measured. Connor has a little bit of passive lateral rotation of his hips that I'm battling a bit, which is not a problem. We love you for it, Connor. It's what makes you you. Okay, so I'm going to hold on this way, and then I'm going to move his calcaneus this way. Okay, so I have him at 32 degrees into inversion. In eversion, I have him at 6. If I'm super generous. Okay? So similar to radial and ulnar deviation, the total range will be about 50. And we'll see the same thing at the ankle. So even if someone is lacking in one direction, they'll typically make up for it in the other direction. Connor has pretty nice inversion range of motion, both in across all of his joints. His eversion is more limited in his subtalar joint than he is in his talar curl or mid-tarsal joints. Okay, so that's why we measure this in 2 different places. Because if we wanted to mobilize him, we would mobilize his subtalar joint rather than mobilize his talar curl joint, for example, if we wanted to increase his eversion. Okay? So those are those 4. The rest, I think, are all toes. Okay, so go ahead and flip over for me. So it doesn't matter if the knee position for any of the toe measurements. Now, for those of us who have bunions, which you will notice I very seldom wear sandals, but I wore them today to show off really atrocious bunions. Knowing the abduction of the MTP joint matters. Okay, so on this foot, at least last time we measured, I was at 47 degrees, and this one isn't quite so bad yet. And so we want to know that abduction. But when you're measuring that abduction, you want to make sure that you're following the metatarsal this way and not keeping it straight. Okay? So if we were going to measure abduction of the MTP, again, this is the goniometer to use. The reason I'm moving this is because then I can tell which is the moving axis, right? Because the protractor's not moving. So for MTP abduction, I'm going to have him here, and he's not. He's got a little bit of a... So for abduction, we're going to measure the resting position, and that's a postural measure, so similar to what we had for carrying angle. Okay. But then we can also measure how far out he can come. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. So Remember, just like the hand, we're actually drawing a line through the foot. So going towards midline is adduction, and so that's what we're measuring for bunions, is the static position of adduction, and abduction is how far the toe can leave the midline going that way. So abduction is that way. So for someone who has bunions like mine, it's important to know the resting adduction position, but then you want to know how far out you can get it to see if it will still align. And on my left foot you could, but on my right foot you can't get it to neutral anymore.
So you'd be lacking in abduction.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. When we get to testing the abductor hallucis, you'll see that that's a hard motion to do actively. So for a lot of the toes, we're going to be measuring those passively, but you could measure them all actively as well. Okay. Now for toe motions, again, you would not normally use a goniometer that's this long. So for the great toe, you're going to have the goniometer along the side. I'll show you on this foot. And you're going to do it just like we always did. So the stationary arm is going to be on the proximal segment. The moving arm is going to be on the distal segment with the axis right on the joint of interest. So if we were measuring MTP motion, so Connor has pretty high arches. Okay, so his resting position is not at 0. So then the question is, can I get him to 0? And I can. If I couldn't get him to 0, then I would document his extension as 11 to whatever he could get to. Okay? And then if I wanted to measure his passive range of motion, I want to make sure you stay on the side of the joint, and then I can measure his passive motion as well. Okay? And you would do the same thing for the IP joint that we did for the fingers. Now with a shorter arm on the goniometer, you can also measure on the top of the foot, and then have if we measure IP, I can fold this over the top of the IP joint, and as long as my two arms are parallel to the bones, that's a valid measurement. Okay? It gets to be much trickier to do for extension, but for a flexion you can cheat a little bit. It gets harder if because these arms are so long. Okay? So practice measuring toe measurements and the inversion and eversion, both the supine and the prone way. Okay?